Awesome. Thanks for that exciting kickoff, Rachel. Welcome everyone to today's 101 Learning Series kickoff session. It's awesome to see so many new faces with us here today. We have such a global representation. I'm Tay Lottie. I'm with the nRhythm Capital Institute and with Life Educational Programs team, and I'm really excited to be here with Tre Cates and John Fullerton, and we're going to spend the hour just diving into unpacking some of the top five misunderstandings that we've seen come up again and again and again around people diving into this work of regenerative economics and business. And Rach, maybe if we could add a spotlight to John and Trey and I so we can all jump into the conversation. John and Trey have been teaching and practicing regenerative economics and regenerative business development in a variety of different contexts and sectors for over a decade now, probably more than that. And with the growing adoption of this approach, we've learned a lot about what works and what doesn't in terms of the impact that it creates when it's practiced. And that's a lot of the focus of today's conversation. We're going to dive into that. We're going to untangle some of those things. We're going to share stories from the field. And the intention of the session today in this hour is to just provide some clear, basic, and actionable insights to you all on what works and what doesn't for, putting these concepts into practice in your own work, in your own communities, in your own lives. So thank you all for joining us here today. And before we jump in, there are some new faces. So for those of you who don't know Tre Cates or John Fullerton, Tre Cates is the founder and director of nRhythm. He's a globally recognized organizational design consultant. He's a serial entrepreneur, and he's held a variety of different C-suite roles with deep experience in regenerative business practice and development and many other things that we don't need to get into his whole spiel, but John Fullerton is the founder and president of the Capital Institute. He's a former managing director at the old JP Morgan, turned impact investor and the architect of regenerative economics, and still one of the leading thought leaders in that today. So building off of a jumping point here with some people, there could be a handful of folks here that are just coming to this work for the first time. And before we jump into some storytelling from Trey and John about some of the misconceptions of this work, I'd love to hear from each of you just some quick definitions, like just on a high level, what is regenerative economics and what is regenerative business? So I'll toss it over to you first, John. How would you define regenerative economics?
I would say regenerative economics is understanding our economy as a living system and not as a machine, and and therefore needing to understand how living systems work, which is what we call the regenerative process. That's a scientific term, not just an adjective. So if the process of life is regeneration, we need to learn the process of life and then apply it to our entire economy. And the economy, one of the interesting things I've learned through this experience of teaching is unless you're an economist or maybe work in finance or in some cases business, but often not even in business, people don't really know what the economy is. It's like the water we swim in. So it's this abstraction. And just to explain that for people, the economy literally is the sum of all of the enterprises that make up the economy. And that actually identifies part of the problem because we literally add the throughput or the sales or the spending in the case of government of all of these different enterprises or organizations. And we add it all together and we call that the economy.
Mm,
But that's the way you think about a machine, not a living organism, because we know a living organism is far greater than the sum of the parts.
mm,
But that's absent from our entire framing of an economy.
mm. Yeah, and that's such a good point of, what is it, Trey, about how we define regenerative business that adds up to all of those pieces in the regenerative economy?
Yeah, so just to build off of John, when I think about this in conversations with the very practical aspects of business, it's recognizing that we tend to externalize what we don't want so that we can manage what we do want. And in doing so, we tend to design more like a machine than the realities of what John just said, which is the livingness or the life in that system, the life in that organization. And so, really, it's reorienting and recognizing that this is life, this is full of life, and how do we create conditions to enhance it versus create conditions to control or subdue it. And that's a lesson we've been trying to learn for a very, very long time. We've got all kinds of cultures and peoples who have found ways to work in rhythm with life. But ultimately, we've not really found a way to do that from an economic or a business perspective. And I think the work John's doing, we're doing, really lands in what does it look like to create conditions for more life, and to with more life comes all kinds of different abundance that I think we're not experiencing, or potential as a part of that process.
Mm, right. Yeah. And to maybe kind of lead that Trey, that broader definition of what regenerative business is, I think you kind of called out one of the key misconceptions that we wanted to dive into first around how people often come to this approach from the current lens of, oh, the way that my business is operating or the way the business is operating in general is broken. So I can just apply these regenerative design or operating principles onto, you know, my current business model or the current way of that we're operating this. And I think this is a sneaky one, like this is sort of the initial, okay, what is it that you've learned, Trey, in your experience of when someone comes to this and is trying to apply it to their current frame, and all the experience that you've had around how they're just trying to apply like the regenerative tools and frameworks to the way that they're currently operating? Where have you seen that happens most, or like why does that not work?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is we're so used to in business school being taught, or in our educational process, or in our uh, groups that are supporting business approaches and organizations and operations, to embrace the next best thing. Oh, this next new model or this next new approach. And in essence, this is not that. So if all of a sudden we're just going to say, hey, we're looking for the next silver bullet, this is not regeneration. And it's definitely not something you just kind of throw on a label and say, now we're doing this, which has been the danger even in the regenerative food and agriculture movement, where we're not really going to change anything in the organization or the operations. And now we're just going to use this label. We're going to market it differently.
Mm,
Really, at the essence of this is, what does it look like to design around the life in the system? And that our operations, business models, and practices are designed not to extract from life, but to enhance it. And I believe we can do it. And actually, I often even go farther in saying we've spent the last couple of 100 years learning how to extract. Why don't we spend some time learning how to create and build around the life in the system? Because I think we get more benefit, and we've just not had the opportunity to design that way in a really consistent way. So this is just leaning us into, it's not a label, it's not a model, it is recognizing that this is a living system, and in a living system, we've got to manage and design differently.
Right. And
If I
yeah.
can just jump on and add a point to that, Tay, before you redirect me where you want me to go. There's actually it's kind of interesting history, but there's a very logical and understandable reason why we've done this. It's not like we're stupid or we're evil. Um, the history of this practice, both in the practice of business and in the discipline of economics, which is ultimately about the practice of business as well as non-business organizations. And this is, by the way, this is true for government organizations. This is true for our healthcare system. This is true for our education system. It's kind of true for everything in the Western modern age, which, broadly can be traced back to the scientific revolution. With all of the great advances of the scientific revolution that allowed us to understand the world we live in, we did it through what's called the reductionist method, which is to break down things that are complicated into parts and understand the parts. And then we began to think about reality as the sum of as a bunch of parts, as if it were a machine. And you can trace in economics the history of neoclassical economics literally to Newtonian physics, where the neoclassical economists took the equations and the mathematics from Newtonian physics, by the way, not quantum physics, and applied it on the assumption that there had to be equivalent laws for an economy. And then in the business academy, Taylor, who's sort of the father of modern management, did the exact same thing with management and treated an organization as a machine that you could optimize. And that's literally the history of modern management science. Management science, note we call it. And economics became called a science, which means reductionist science. And then we did the same thing in governance. And I'm blanking on the guy's name who established, not Merkel, but something that sounds like that. He established corporate governance as a science. And so it wasn't because we were, that this was our understanding of what science means. But the big distinction is that our modern age science grew out of this reductionist problem solving method. And our latest science, most notably the Nobel Prize for Physics in 2022, this idea of universal entanglement, our latest science proves to us, tells us, reminds us that everything is connected and interdependent.
Right.
Everything isn't just a bunch of parts.
Right.
So we're stuck with a wrong
Right.
foundational framework.
Right. I love that you're taking us there, John, because I think that that's one of the fundamental misconceptions is the way that science also led to, in most business, finance, and economic contexts, we've been taught to solve problems like engineers, isolate the issue, apply a fix, and repeat. Um,
And
but
specialize in
and
silos.
and specialize in silos, exactly. And fundamentally, a regenerative approach asks an entire different question, right? Like,
Mhm.
what kind of system is this? And what does it need to thrive? It's an entire different approach. And I'd love for you, Trey, to kind of build off of this, rather than folks coming into this and being like, oh, the economy or business is a machine that we need to fix with a new regenerative approach. It's actually like, how do we turn this factory into a forest?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, actually, we'll build off everything John said in that kind of design where all of that was reduced to parts for purposes and specialization for purposes of maximizing productivity
Hmm.
and efficiency. That is its entire design. When we think about a living system, what we're monitoring is the health in the system. Health is not even a concept in an industrialized reductionist paradigm. Uh, we are continually thinking about how do we maximize and minimize versus synergize as a part of what is the life in the system. Mm. So when we think about how we're reimagining these designs, it is not so much that productivity and efficiency can't be things that we pay attention to or monitor. It's just that we monitor those in relationship to its root causes, which is the health in the system. And how do we continue to recognize how to monitor, be aware of, and then design around that to create even more abundant outcomes. And one other thing to just add to this, the current system actually, despite how much we have bought into it, is not very productive or efficient. We just need to call that out. I mean, let's just use the food system example. Who in their right mind would think that 50% waste in a global food system is a good design? But it's benefited a few, and there has been some, forward momentum in how we were addressing and managing that. But ultimately, it's created all these unintended consequences. And to John's point, we can go across our partnerships and continue to work in the education space, in the healthcare space, in the community development space, manufacturing, all these different sectors that actually have the same symptom issues. It's not just in one space, it's across all sectors of our society.
Yeah, maybe to build off of that, John, some of the fundamental tenets of regenerative economics and, the 8 principles of regenerative vitality are exactly defining the difference between a reductionist approach and one that embraces complexity. And maybe you could speak a little bit to what that means.
Sure. Yeah, and actually that highlights one of the challenges of communicating / teaching this. I think, when I started, it was sort of novel to talk about complexity. And in fact, in my own re-education, I had no idea there was such a thing as complexity science. And it turns out you can get a PhD in complexity science at MIT. And it turns out that the authors of Limits to Growth were some of the early students in the complexity science department at MIT. But there's different kinds of complexity, and there's different ways to think about complexity. And I'm still working on how to understand this and communicate it. But the way I would describe it today is that we can use complexity science as a descriptive tool. And most of you have seen these complicated diagrams with nodes and feedback loops, and the complexity of any complex system is kind of overwhelming. And so one of the tools that people are using, including in economics and business, is to try to map the system that they're interested in understanding and then changing. And by mapping a system, you're trying to describe the way the system works. And there's speculators on Wall Street that use complexity science to understand the system so they can speculate in it better. This is what I would call mechanistic descriptive use of complexity science. And here's one of the big misunderstandings about the regenerative paradigm. In regenerative thinking, we are using living systems, complex living systems, as a design principle. In other words, we're trying to understand why they're living systems and not collapsed systems, and then see the patterns and principles that describe them. And the amazing thing is that while you can't reduce living systems to equations, you can find these patterns that repeat. And their tendencies toward, as an example, I like to use, women tend to be smaller than men. but that doesn't mean all women are smaller than all men. So there's a pattern that men are larger than women in the human species. And so that's a pattern we would describe. In the same way, these patterns and principles, first principles, not values, but like design principles, like things that need to be true for the system to be regenerative. They exist in living systems. So the regenerative paradigm is actually prescriptive, not descriptive, with respect to the complexity we're shooting for. And that really changes everything because if it's prescriptive, then you're saying, well, what are the design principles we need to begin with? And if we don't start at the beginning, we're not going to end up with a regenerative economy or a regenerative business.
Mm, mm. I love that. They're prescriptive, not descriptive. I wonder, building off of that, grounding this into some of the ways you see this emerge, Trey, in the complexity of designing and managing and monitoring an organization as a living system, which is so much of how we root the idea of regenerative business into practice. I've heard you explain in so many ways the difference of problem solving that happens in that context of like, what is it like to solve a simple problem like baking a cake versus a complicated problem like sending a rocket to the moon versus a complex problem like solving poverty or raising a child. Um, I'm wondering if you could speak to a little bit of like those distinguishing factors and yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I will say is those first two buckets, simple and complicated, have been incredibly um, um, used to develop all kinds of products. It's actually the best way for us to design things we make.
Hmm.
And we'll continue to use those reductionist designs as a way to be able to make machines, right? They are designed to do one thing well. They're designed to continue to improve upon that one thing of being even more productive or more efficient in terms of it as a tool to be used. But those are known variables. There are known inputs, and we can relatively rely on it being able to create the same outcomes over and over and over. But when we think about complexity, there's so many different variables. The inputs are not completely known. And as a result, our management and approach should be different. And I think part of our challenge today is we've taken the approach that we've used in buckets 1 and 2 and have applied it to the problems and challenges and complexity. And that's why we get all these unintended consequences. The other thing I will say as a part of that is 1 and 2 has made us addicted to prediction. We can predict we're going to get these outcomes. In complexity and the world that we live in, that prediction has forced prescriptions and best practices that really degrade the health and the life in the system. We need to build capacity around responsiveness and to be able to dynamically adapt and change based on those changing conditions. And there are things, I use the example of when I plant an apple tree, I definitely am planting an apple tree to get apples. I'm not trying to get pears or peaches, right? So there is some predictive aspect of it. But in reality, what we realize and what we need in a world where we're trying to manage all kinds of different variabilities is the responsiveness to what emerges in the system. And I, as a former top-down type A CEO of some really larger growing businesses, I actually co-opted a lot of what was really emergence, and I would call it as though I had planned it. And in reality, it wasn't true. I I was so much needing to prove myself that I actually predicted all this to happen. And in reality, the majority of it I didn't. And I think we have to get comfortable recognizing that we need to be responsive, and that's the capacity that we've got to build and
Mm.
and create real opportunities for us to both have the both and outcomes that we want to achieve, and then the beauty of things that emerge that we didn't plan, and how that is where abundance and potential can show up.
Mm.
which happens to be a first principle.
That's right.
Innovation that's adaptive and responsive, not just innovation for the sake of innovation.
That's right.
Right. And I love that you've brought into this piece of the conversation that's really calling out, Tre, like where you saw this shift for yourself in terms of your own mindset and your own management. And I think it is actually one of the biggest barriers to most people coming to this work is holding this idea of, oh, regenerative business, regenerative economics, regenerative thinking is only for certain people. It's only for certain sectors. It only works in agriculture. It only works in NGOs. It only works in, impact driven spaces. Or like, I won't be able to do this unless I can prove that it works. Like, I need to be able to see the results. I need to see that, like, prove it to me type of, aspect to this work. And John, I know that that was a huge piece of the work that you had been doing in all of finance and economic spaces around this before jumping into what does it actually look like for us to not approach this from that perspective of like everything needs to be measured and predictable in that specific way. And I'd love to hear you build off of that from your experience.
Yeah, it's interesting. I people that have been around me know that I have sort of an allergic reaction to metrics. And in finance, everybody wants to talk about metrics. So we have ESG and we have impact metrics and we measure, 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 measure. And I think it's sort of ironic because I actually used to be a derivatives guy. So you would think that I'm kind of analytical, but I literally have an allergic reaction. As soon as we drop into show me the numbers, show me the metrics, I think we've kind of lost the battle because the shift we're talking about is so much bigger. I mean, we don't need metrics to know that we've got too much, that every company on the planet is emitting too much carbon. And whether my excess is 20% or 500% or 5,000%, we know it's too much and we know in aggregate it's too much. And so like we don't need reports. Just get to work and stop emitting carbon. What we do need though is to understand that it's not just emissions, it's also how much carbon are we sequestering? It's the carbon cycle. So we've missed the most important question, which
Mm.
is it's about the carbon cycle, not carbon emissions. And as a result of that, we've spent 25 years talking about emissions and literally not talking about the natural carbon sinks in any of the COP. And I was at the Paris COP 10 years ago and in a small meeting, and I asked James Hansen, of all people, I said, why aren't we talking about natural carbon sequestration? And I rolled out my Alan Savory, land, grasslands, blah blah blah, and he said, well, the science doesn't prove that it works. This is the leading climate scientist on planet Earth asserting that it doesn't work. And the
Mm.
reason it doesn't work is because there's peer-reviewed science that says it doesn't work, because the peer-reviewed science takes a reductionist approach to analyze a bunch of data rather than walking out onto a landscape and seeing the difference between holistically managed and industrially managed landscapes. So we're so lost at the big picture, and then we want to jump into the numbers that it drives me nuts, to be honest. But the thing that I would just finally add is that for me it wasn't so much like for me the discovering this living systems frame was kind of the relief. The the shock came from reading Limits to Growth and from understanding that exponential growth on a finite planet is in conflict with the laws of physics and that it cannot go on one way or the other. It will not go on. And yet I understood as a finance guy that the economy is what's driving that growth by design. And it's people like me who think they're so smart that are driving the growth because the finance algorithm is kind of what keeps us locked in the system. So it was this, for me, it was this sort of rolling epiphany that everything I've been taught for and practiced for 20 years was impossible to continue.
Mm,
That sent me on a search for an alternative path.
mm. Yeah, I also hear that in that initial jump into this work, that focus on carbon emissions or focusing on measuring what we're doing to reduce the harm that is, currently going on, I think kind of leads us into this broader question around what is it about regenerative economics that is different than just sustainability or, it's different than just ESG or what we're doing to work within the current system to reduce harm. You say all the time, John, like it's not about tweaking the current system. It's about us actually choosing this pathway of stepping into a new way of seeing, leading, and being for the 21st century. And I'd love to hear you expand a little bit on that.
Sure. I think the first thing to say is that I'm 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 not against ESG and and so many of the and the whole sustainability you know industry. Thank God for it because it's gotten us moving in the right direction. And everything that we do in the sustainability, ESG, impact investing, B Corp context is part of the way I see the regenerative economy embraces all that and extends beyond it. It's not in conflict with any of it.
Mm,
Same with ecological economics. I mean, ecological economics is the first serious economics framework that understood that the economy is embedded in the biosphere and not separate from the biosphere. And
mm,
so that's a prerequisite to a regenerative economy. It's not at all in conflict with it. The thing that's unique about the living systems paradigm, and this gets a bit abstract maybe, but it's the goal is to manifest potential that we can't yet see. As Tre was saying before,
mm,
it's essentially creating potential for positive things to happen that you don't plan on. That's that's what we call regenerative potential. You know, the
mm,
potential of Einstein was manifested when his parents met each other. That made the possibility of Einstein a reality. And before that happened, there's no E equals MC squared, unless someone else thought of it. The potential of water happens when two molecules of hydrogen and one molecule of oxygen come together in right relationship. And think of the potential that water creates for life on this planet. So the hopeful message of the regenerative paradigm is that if we align with how life works, we're going to unlock all kinds of potential we don't know exists, which by definition is outside the materialist, reductionist logic worldview of the modern age. It's some people would say a leap of faith, but it's a leap of faith based on billions of years of evolutionary proof that it's actually the process that explains why we're all here having this conversation. And it
mm.
explains why the internet emerged out of thin air. And it explains why the Berlin Wall fell out of thin air. And so, and now I lost track of what your question was. So I'll just stop talking. But actually, I do want to go back to something Tre said, if I can, real briefly, that this issue between complicated and complex has always been important, but the context within which it's important is changing exponentially. So when the modern age started, there was whatever, hundreds of millions of people on the planet, not billions. And the economy was tiny relative to the biosphere. And now that's all changed. And so so two points I want to make. One is that we're now in what we call the polycrisis. So this issue, and this is why I'm so committed to, education as a foundational, as the focus of my life, as opposed to running around doing impact investing or starting a company or doing whatever, is that if we don't learn this, the consequences are going to be exponentially worse in the future than they've been in the past, because we're now in the context of the polycrisis. And so this matters way more than it did even 10 years ago. And secondly, we need to understand that our culture, particularly in the United States, celebrates the left brain, reductionist logic, competitive, analytical thinking type of mind. And Ian McGilchrist does great work on this with his book, The Master and the Emissary. But we essentially, our system, our economy rewards left brain dominant thinking. And so that's where the tech bro expertise lies. That's where the finance expertise lies. And so we need to reorient our whole value system and have much more understanding and appreciation for the part of our thinking that occurs largely in the right brain, the intuitive, the creative, the collaborative, the feminine, or we're going to go off a cliff. So this reorientation, this paradigm shift it's the whole deal, because until that's done, we can't teach people regenerative economy without understanding this foundational piece of it. And that, getting back to the purpose of today's conversation, that's the biggest challenge is to not jump into give me the KPIs, but to understand it's way bigger than KPIs.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm so glad you're leading us towards like the foundational piece of what it means to actually unlearn and relearn a new mindset, behaviors, and practices around how we practice all of this and actually create regenerative businesses, create a regenerative economy, all of that. And Tre, I'd love to hear you expand upon that. I know that that's a really fundamental part of all the work that you do.
I mean, thanks, Tay, and thank you, John, and just really the depth of those comments. I mean, in reality, we need to have a posture, a deep posture of humility in all of this. I think we became addicted to the idea that we could figure it out and that would be constant and static. Like it would be always that. And the beauty of what is emerging for all of us is there is more and more life to understand. And we've continued to act as if we've got it, nailed. And unfortunately, that puts us in the wrong headspace. It gets us moving in the direction that John said, which is around proving, controlling, reducing, designing and implementing in a way that can guarantee something versus the beauty of being responsive and the capacity needed to be responsive to those changing dynamics. That is where resilience comes from. One of the largest corporations in the world just recently reached out to us, and they say, we have discovered that we need to figure out what resilience really is for us. What is resilience? Resilience isn't a steady state. It doesn't just stay one way. There is no linear movement towards resilience. It's the ability to adapt to all of these changing dynamics and still have capacity to move forward as a part of that process. And unfortunately, we have not built organizations and capacity to be able to do that. It's been limited, time framed in a way that serves very few people and specific criteria versus
Mm,
the realities of what our community needs. And so John calling out the feminine, the responsiveness, the ability to intuit and be in relationship is everything.
mm,
It is absolutely everything versus in a lot of transactions.
mm, mm. Yeah, and in that case of like, let's just pan this out. One of the biggest organizations in the world comes to this and they're like, okay, we need to learn to be resilient. So you're telling me I can just apply this regenerative framework. I can apply these regenerative approaches. I can use these regenerative principles and then I'm regenerative. What
Yeah.
is it about that misconception, right? Of like, um,
Yeah.
how do like both of you two have this amazing way of helping people see regeneration more as a verb, like it's something to live. It's not a noun. It's not something to achieve. Um,
Yeah, I mean, just to build off of that, and I know, John, you'll have something to comment on this. We tend to believe, and you said this early on, Tay, that small organizations or values-based organizations or mission-based organizations, purpose-based organizations are only people or organizations that actually do this. When you really get into the economy, there's no way this can be really applied and actually practiced. And
mm.
that's just bullshit. That's not true. It really can be. It's just we need to have a different mindset as we approach it. And one of the most competitive organizations we could ever be a part of is a sports organization. And I love what Phil Jackson said. Winner of 11 NBA championships. This is what he said when he's talking about the essence of his approach. The most we can hope for is to create the best possible conditions, then let go of the outcomes.
Mhm.
What makes us believe that the only way to do it is to control and force and get everybody to do it exactly the way you're doing it as a way to get the outcomes that you want? We've been taught that. It's been reinforced in all our education. It's reinforced in the economy. It's reinforced in most of our society, and it is destroying us.
Mm,
What can we do to recognize the reality is there's a different way to do all this? It doesn't have to be that way. And even the most competitive of industries have found ways to say it can be different. We
mm,
don't have to do that way. And you could even talk to the people who were a part of Phil Jackson's teams. It was a very different environment, yet it was incredibly successful. The abundance is very clear.
mm,
So, what can we do to build that capacity? To
mm,
stop being lazy and continuing to embrace an industrialized economy and process to one that builds something, is different, and actually serves future generations as a part of our current approach.
mm, mm,
One thing I'd maybe jump in on this, Tay, again, is that this doesn't need to feel overwhelming. As Tre said, there are examples of it in the real world. There are bold leaders experimenting, taking risks, failing, trying again in the real world.
mm,
That's not easy. It's like changing the engines while the plane's flying. Believe me, we all get that. But the other piece of this is that this is really the language I'm using increasingly is this is a revolution in the way we see. So
mhm,
there's the regenerative economy hidden in plain sight everywhere. We just don't see it that way. So, for example, the internet, one of the principles of a healthy organism is the robust circulation, the metabolism of energy in the organism, of resources, nutrients in the organism. And in an economy, particularly a modern economy, which is fundamentally an information economy, the circulation of information is fundamental to a healthy economy. And out of sort of nowhere, in our lifetime, the internet emerges. The internet is the most regenerative technology I can think of. But our business models have allowed businesses to use the internet in a highly extractive, degenerative way that
mm,
has, you know, essentially harmed, if not destroyed, democracy and has causing huge harm to our kids and to ourselves because of these addictive algorithms. So the regenerative economy is waiting to unfold. We just need to be smart enough to know how to govern, in this case, a technology in a regenerative way. So we're like right there. We just screwed up one of the details. And another example is that I always, anyone who's in my course has heard me say this 10 times. The Mondragon cooperatives in the Basque Country in Spain are a, 70-year-old example, 80 companies, all owned by the employees, cooperative ownership. Collectively, it's several billion euros of annual sales, global in nature, multiple industries, not necessarily the greenest industries. A lot of it is manufacturing. But the world studies Mondragon all the time. The new economy, students study Mondragon all the time, and they come away saying, "Oh, the silver bullet is co-ops. We need cooperative ownership, and then things will be good."
Mhm.
Well, it turns out there's an incredible culture in the Basque Country that's probably the primary reason for the Mondragon success. And secondly, someone's been to Mondragon. Secondly, they manage these 80 companies as a single ecosystem. The Mondragon Cooperatives is the regenerative economy at scale. It happens to be cooperative ownership, but it could easily be other forms of ownership, as they would freely admit or do freely admit. And by the way, they freely admit this that we're capitalists, quote unquote. So the problem isn't capitalism. The problem isn't capitalism versus socialism. The
Mhm.
problem is, do we manage as a health for the health of an ecosystem
Mm,
as the purpose, or do we
mm,
manage for individual
mm.
extraction and personal wealth and quote
Yeah.
success?
Yeah.
And the people that work there, success for them is legacy, period. One word.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah, one thing real quick, Tay, I just want to build off of that. We've also become really good at making form sacred versus recognizing the power of underlying process.
Mm,
Mm,
And and so the idea that the co-op would be the silver bullet, it's not. It's how we make decisions. It's what and how we organize ourselves together in those contexts. And that means form is just a tool that
mm,
can come up in all kinds of different ways and actually be relevant and meaningful,
mm,
right?
mm.
So, what does it look like for us to continue to commit to process? What's the underlying ecosystem process that creates conditions for health, and then allow form to emerge and then be able to be adaptive?
Mm.
Because form will need to change based on the changing conditions versus prescriptive best practice. There's only one way to do it. And then
right.
what we've turned into sacred is the things that get us in trouble as
Yeah.
being something that we now copy to fix versus a commitment to a process that can be adaptive and responsive.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
just if I could just throw one more
Yeah.
point just to drill down on Mondragon. So most people would think, well, how the hell do you manage 80 companies where everyone has a say on everything? Well, of course, everyone doesn't have a say on everything. Of course, there's hierarchy. And it turns out what I learned when I visited is that there's an intuitive understanding that if the worker owners whose literal savings are their capital account in Mondragon,
Mm,
they may have a 401k on the side, but primarily they are fully invested in the success of the Mondragon ecosystem. The trade-off or the agreement for delegating up big decision-making responsibility to managers, to leaders, is a huge investment and commitment to communication. And so the head of the bank told me he has multiple meetings per week. For some reason, the typical size of the meetings are 11 people. So this is not some group, you know, city hall announcement. This is in-depth intentional meetings in small groups in offices communicating about what's going on. And it turns out in a healthy living organism, at a cellular level, if you're not communicating accurate information, you die. So again,
Right,
they
right,
intuit behaving as a living organism.
right, right. And to ground this even more, like and I'm seeing in the chat, first of all, there's someone here from Mondragon, which is amazing.
Oh,
Welcome,
cool.
Carlos.
I hope I'm not
And
screwing it up.
yeah. Um, but other folks have been throwing in the chat, like, so how do you manage an ecosystem? And I would love to, as we're sort of coming closer towards the end of this, um, to invite Trey and John, and maybe starting with you, Trey, to speak a little bit to like what are the ways that through a approach to building regenerative business, through, framework for living systems, organizational design, and all of that, are we managing organisms, economies as living systems, and what are we monitoring and measuring? So back to our point earlier, yes, there's certain metrics that aren't helpful, but there are metrics that are very helpful. To your point, John, about how do we monitor if our body is healthy or not? There are certain metrics that we're tuning into. There's different approaches we have towards monitoring and managing our own body as a living system. And so like Trey, I'd love to hear you just speak a little bit to, and this is something that, we dive more into a lot of our educational content, but like just giving high level, what does that look like to actually manage like an ecosystem?
Yeah, and actually, even more accurately in terms of approach is how can we continue to enhance and partner around what we consider the energy in the system.
Hmm.
So if we can monitor where energy is, and then began to enhance those conditions to for more, it changes how responsive and what the capacity is for us to be able to do incredible things in the system. I I don't think we understand the realities of what it looks like to have really responsive capacity.
Hmm.
And we see it in nature all over the place of what happens when certain conditions show up and the abundance that comes from that. So
Hmm.
for us, it's about understanding and monitoring the energy and information in the system and how it's flowing and cycling. And with that, and to John's point earlier, it is about flows and cycles.
Hmm.
And us becoming more sensitive to the flows and cycles and what we do to enhance them is really what the work is. And
Hmm.
then the outcomes begin to take care of themselves. I truly believe that. And we can have really strong intention, and then we can also have room for emergence as a part of that process. But if we just become more sensitized to designing around the energy and the information as it flows and cycles in the system, everything John just talked about and the things we're talking about, both abstractly in a practical way, become very relevant. And we can create very different outcomes and experiences for ourselves and our communities.
Hmm.
Yeah, and the nRhythm has a wonderful and quite simple health index as a way to measure an organization's health. And it's frankly much better than the work that we've done at Capital Institute because it's very tangible, usable. You create your own data from questionnaires and whatnot. But there is for those that are interested in the science of this, there's a field of science called energy flow network science. So flow networks are a thing. There's living and non-living flow networks. So like a bolt of lightning is a non-living flow network, but you can learn a lot from the structure of a bolt of lightning that applies to living structures. And one of my early science advisors, Sally Gorner, is part of this flow network society of academics. And for those that are interested, we've developed sort of a 10 measures of regenerative vitality
Hmm.
that are intended to be highly rigorous scientific approaches to measuring the health of a living organism. And they map roughly to the eight principles, not exactly because they were developed independently, but it's kind of an interesting confirmation that they map relatively closely. The challenge is that we don't yet really have the data of the things we actually need to measure. So, for example, if relationships of mutualism are fundamental, do we know whether an exchange, an economic exchange, was one that was mutually beneficial or extractive? We can talk about it with knowledge of an exchange, but we can't find data that says, oh yeah, that one someone got screwed and that one was mutually beneficial. But we can say things like speculation is by definition win-lose. So if the exchanges in the financial system have become 99% speculation, we can say that chances are the financial system is extracting from or degenerating the health of the whole as opposed to contributing to it. So that there's, again, without needing all the data, we can make judgments based on first principles. But for those that are interested in turning regenerative economics into a rigorous science, there is a whole, lifetimes of work to do to develop intrinsic measures of health. Just like when you, as you said, Tay, when you go to the doctor, they measure your blood pressure, not because you care what your blood pressure is, but because it's an intrinsic measure of health. We need the analog to that for economies and for businesses. And when we have those, we can then begin to model different policies. And that's all the future work that is literally decades of development awaiting us.
Yeah, right. And that's where, once we dive into all of this, there's so many amazing examples of how this work is manifesting in different contexts, and people are really putting it to work. And I know we're coming close to time, and thank you, John and Tre, for just really spanning. I feel like we covered so much ground across, what you've learned in ways that people are putting this to work that really does work and they really get it. And there's ways that, we find these barriers along the way. And ultimately, what we're here to offer and what the purpose of this session is to invite all of us, like diving into this series of learning regenerative economics and business 101. It really is a journey. It's a learning journey. It's a whole different way of thinking. It's a way of unlearning. It's a way of relearning a different approach. It's a way of developing your own application of these principles and these patterns and these frameworks into your own context. And I'd love to sort of bring this to a close with an invitation to everyone here to continue your learning journey with us. We have so many different opportunities to dive into what the actual development of regenerative economics and business looks like. And we've built out this this series of being able to get access to our two fundamentals courses. So we have a fundamentals of regenerative economics and a fundamentals of regenerative organizations course, where if you dive into this bundle, it's really just the deep dive into this is the basic concepts that you need to unlearn and relearn, to then jump into deeper conversations with John and Tre around what this means for you in your context and how we continue to do this work together. And for anyone that's already been on this journey, it's an amazing refresher to dive back into. So we'll share some links for how to get engaged in this and continue these conversations. But as a whole, just a huge thank you to everyone here today to be part of this collective journey that we all go on of diving into what we're learning of what works and what doesn't. And we'll continue to do that together. So thank you, John. Thank you, Tre. Thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Tay.
everyone.
Thanks, John.